Okay, so I think you can hear me. I know I'm live on Facebook. Um, it's been a while since we've done one of these live streams. We used to do them for a few weeks, pretty frequently, every other day, that kind of thing. The last one was a reading of, I believe it was the epilogue or the closing words, closing statements by Max Blumenthal in The Management of Savagery. So we're going to stay live for a few minutes before we um, start reading. I want to make sure I'm live on all the platforms that I normally go live on. One of the reasons I started um, live streaming to multiple platforms at once was because I have a habit of just saying whatever I'm feeling, and I didn't want to get banned. And if I did get banned, I wanted to be able to pivot to another platform. So it was kind of a hit them on all fronts kind of strategy, but we are moving away from that kind of thing. So, evolution or evolving as a person, that kind of thing. Um, I was actually going to read Wretched of the Earth, but I was actually afraid I'd probably get banned if I did like a word for word reading of that book. It's pretty intense. So, it looks like I am in fact live on all the platforms I want to be live on. I might end up getting like a Kindle stick or a selfie stick of some sort, so I can like I don't know mount my camera here and stream to Instagram as well because I don't believe that this software does Instagram. So I'm just gonna quickly check my volume, and that's working. And so if you read the um, title of today. It's going to be a reading of the 51-day war in Gaza. And for people who have watched my previous streams, I've done readings of other books. I did the Communist Manifesto. I did a chapter of the Management of Savagery, as I had mentioned. Um, and a chapter of Surveillance Valley, which covered sort of like, uh, if I recall correctly, it was a chapter covering sort of the origins of the internet, which got its start in the Vietnam War, surprisingly. What else? I did a reading of Einstein's paper on why socialism. So, given what's going on in the world today and what happened recently in Gaza, I think it's very important to, as I mentioned on Facebook, give sort of a human face to Gaza, because a lot of people dehumanize Gaza, and it's one of the worst places in the world, humanitarian tragedy wise, and it has been for quite some time. So it's my hope that through this and other things, I can help give a human face to Gaza. Um, at least do my small part in doing so. So we're going to be reading this off my laptop, and it starts with, let me move my little, well, sorry that mouse cursor is there, but it starts with a photo of a remote controlled machine gun at the Erez border crossing of Gaza. Um, I wanted you to see that photo before we start. And I'm reading this on my Kindle. You can buy this book in a variety of places. They're actually somewhat out of stock. Unfortunately, maybe book sales have been up. So this is on the Kindle app, which I purchased on Amazon just prior to the stream. Um, so we'll start with this, and for the people in Vegas, hopefully we'll be organizing study groups of other books within the near future. to continue the education on Palestine and Gaza, because as I had also said, it's very important to educate people while the war is cold and not hot. I guess that's one way you could say it. So again, I've never read this book, but I've heard good things. I had a chapter recommended to me, which is actually the fourth chapter, as being the most dramatic. But I want to read that, but the problem is that I think I want to do this entire book on live stream. It's less than 300 pages, so I think that's doable. It might be prolonged. We'll see how I feel. I have ADHD, so sometimes projects get put down for a little bit. That being said, if it seems like it's going in that direction, I'm going to try to just maybe skip ahead to the chapter on the Battle of Shujaiya, which, chapter 4. So this is the introduction, and may as well start. I like to sort of just jump into things after I've given people a chance to join. So, without further ado, the first thing a visitor sees upon entering the Gaza Strip through Israel's Erez border crossing is a remote-controlled machine gun perched atop a concrete wall that extends as far as the eye can see. The first thing a visitor hears is the hum of an Israeli drone that hovers constantly above Gaza and forms the sonic backdrop of its residents' lives. After just a few minutes in Gaza, it becomes abundantly apparent that this is among the most closely surveilled and intensely controlled patches of Earth on the planet. The Strip is a ghetto of children. Of its 1.8 million residents, a majority are under the age of 18. Most have never left the 360 square kilometers where they were born, raised, and confined. There is no discernible future for them beyond the Israeli military occupation that has endured nearly 50 years and a siege that was officially proclaimed in 2007. The formative years of these young people have been marked by 3 major military assaults. This was in 2014. By 3 major military assaults. These are their rites of passage. The Palestinians of Gaza have no reason or experience to believe that a fourth war will not arrive soon. The violence in Gaza has become a ritual that has confounded many outsiders, leading to the rise of simplistic explanations for the bloodshed as the product of a religious extremism, endemic anti-Semitism, and intractable conflict. But a brief look at history leading up to the 51-day war of 2014 presents a different reality. 80% of Gaza's residents are refugees from the state of Israel. Their families were among the 750,000 indigenous Palestinians who had fled or were forcibly expelled in the period of November 1947 to late 1948, known to them as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Since Israel was founded, every one of its governments has identified these refugees as a demographic threat whose repatriation would threaten Israel's Jewish majority and the Zionist project itself. Palestinians in Gaza are ultimately confined and excluded from Israel for one simple reason: they are not Jews. Sorry, I can't. Some of this makes me a little emotional. There is one simple reason: they are not Jews. There is simply no place for them in an Israel that defines itself as an exclusive Jewish state, and that will not grant equal rights to these people. This is why Gaza has become a warehouse for a surplus in population that the Israeli-American scholar Martin Kramer described as a superfluous young man. And that is why Gaza resists. A stateless people with no intentionally recognized right to organize an army, navy, no internationally recognized right to organize an army, navy, or air force. Gaza's refugee population nonetheless embarked on an armed campaign against the Israeli occupation that began in earnest in the early 1950s. Some prominent Israelis understood this. The famous 1956 eulogy by Moshe Dayan, then the Israeli Army's chief of staff, for Roy Rottenberg, an Israeli kibbutz guard Palestinian fighters killed near the border of Gaza, was both unusually empathetic about the causes of the conflict and even more committed to continuing it. Quote, let us not cast blame on the murders today. Why should we declare their burning hatred for us? Diane asked, quote, for 8 years they have been sitting in refugee camps in Gaza, and before their eyes we have been transforming the lands and the villages where they and their forefathers previously dwelled into our home. End quote. Summoning his countrymen to persevere in the face of ferocious resistance, Diane declared, quote, we are a generation that settles the land, and without the steel helmet and the cannon's muzzle, we will not be able to plant a tree and build a home. This is the fate of our generation. This is our life's choice, to be ready and armed, tough and hard, or else the sword shall fall from our hand and our lives will be cut short. Diane's eulogy was perhaps the clearest distillation of the mentality that has governed Israel's approach to the Palestinian people in general and to the Gaza Strip in particular for some 60 years. Just as he conceded Israel's colonial ambitions, he also clearly explained the motives behind Palestinian violence. By the end of 2003, as the Second Intifada approached its conclusion, both Israeli and Palestinian societies were near exhaustion. It was then that Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced his intention to pursue, quote, disengagement with Gaza that would reorient its relationship between the two peoples by hardening their separation. Because Sharon's maneuvers entailed the forced evacuation of about 9,000 religious nationalist settlers from the Strip, many proponents of the two-state solution to the crisis of Israel-Palestine were convinced that the right-wing warrior king had experienced a sudden change of heart. Sharon realized that the land had to be partitioned between its two peoples, and that the occupation could not continue, that the Palestinians would have their own state, and that thousands of Israeli settlers would have to be evacuated from the Gaza Strip, end quote. David Grossman, a renowned novelist and voice of Israel's liberal, quote, peace camp, wrote hopefully at the time, with support from liberal and centrist elements, Sharon secured approval for his plan. The Prime Minister's advisors were adamant, however, that separating from Gaza should not be confused with peace. Quote, the significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process, end quote. Senior Sharon advisor Dov Weissglass informed the Israeli paper Haaretz in October 2004, quote, and when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion on refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed indefinitely from our agenda, and all this with authority and permission, all with the presidential blessing and the ratification of both houses of Congress. Sharon's plan was conceived with a substantial input from a notable academic named Arnon Sofer at the University of Haifa, a professor of geostrategy and a consultant to successive governments. Sofer became so pleased with the details of Israel's demographic trench war with the Palestinians that his colleagues referred to him as, quote, Aaron the Arab counter, end quote. Like Weissglass, he advocated Gaza disengagement for reasons that had nothing to do with conflict resolution. Unilateral separation doesn't guarantee peace, Sofer said in 2004. Referring to Sharon's proposal, quote, it guarantees a Jewish Zionist state with an overwhelming majority of Jews. Sofer presently predicted that disengagement would lead to Hamas assuming power in Gaza, and that the unilateral separation could only be enforced through overwhelming violence against Gaza civilians. We will tell the Palestinians that if a single missile is fired over the fence, we will fire 10 in response, and women and children will be killed and houses will be destroyed, he warned. Sofer went on to predict that when 2.5 million people live in a closed-off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe. Those people will be even bigger animals than they are today. With the aid of insane fundamentalist Islam, the pressure at the border will be awful. It's going to be a terrible war. So if we want to remain alive, We will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. End quote. And remember, a lot of what I'm reading are quotes and not, you know, an endorsement of any kind. In January 2006, in an election in occupied Palestine, territories judged, quote, free and fair by the U.S. Congressional Research Service, Hamas, the Islamist organization that earned support through religious charity and armed struggle, won 56% of the seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council. Fatah, the revival to Hamas and the original standard bearer of Palestinian nationalism, joined Hamas in a unity government that existed in name only. The two factions never cooperated. In practice, Fatah rejected the results of the election, while Hamas refused arrangements that required it to share power. I lost my spot. Okay, here we go. After months of bitter skirmishes that left scores of Palestinians dead, the U.S. arranged for massive shipments of arms to the Fatah-controlled Preventative Security Service it had been training. On June 10th, Fatah's forces battled for control of Gaza with Hamas's Al-Qassam brigades. The Al-Qassam brigades were very active in the recent attacks on Gaza. Just as a side note, Fatah was easily routed. For four days later, Fatah leader Mahmoud Abbas declared emergency rule in the West Bank, where his security services coordinated with the Israeli army, while Hamas assumed power in Gaza, where the Al-Qassam brigades maintained a war footing against the occupation. Israel promptly placed Gaza under siege, restricting access to its border crossings, enforcing severe curbs on its exports, and devising complex mathematical formulas to regulate the caloric intake of each resident. A January 2008 Israeli military study called, quote, food consumption in the Gaza Strip, red lines, end quote, estimated the required daily calorie intake in Gaza at 22,079 calories per person, quote, in order to maintain the basic fabric of life, end quote. Everything that has happened since the implementation of Gaza disengagement has borne out the predictions of Weissglass and Sofer. The peace process has been frozen. The prospect of a viable Palestinian state has been shattered. The settlements have expanded and the occupation entrenched. Violent resistance in Gaza has intensified. The Israeli public has taken a hard turn, electing governing coalitions filled with zealots, clamoring for a war to end all wars. Beginning in December 2008, Israel launched a military assault on Gaza that left more than 1,400 dead over the course of 3 weeks, most of them civilians. Violence erupted again in November 2012 with the military escalation that saw more than 400 killed in Gaza, mostly civilians, while Palestinian rockets reached Tel Aviv for the first time. But even after the battle was over, 2 years later, another one loomed on the horizon, the fulfillment of Sofer's bloody prophecy, quote, kill and kill and kill. And that was the introduction. This is chapter 1 called Rogues. As the summer of 2014 began, life continued as normal in the Gaza Strip. Israeli Hermes 450 drones hovered overhead at night, lending a persistent buzzing sound to the coastal enclaves, sonic ambience. Fishermen ran into the teeth of the Israeli Navy whenever they attempted to pursue a school of sardines further than 3 miles into the Mediterranean. Farmers and scavengers risked falling under the hail of bullets if they dared cross into the so-called, quote, buffer zone that extended 300 meters from the concrete walls encircling Gaza. Permits to enter and leave Gaza were more rare than ever, prompting hundreds of college students in the fall of the previous year, to storm the Rafah crossing on the Egyptian border to make good on their scholarships abroad. Unemployment rates hovered above 40%, and anemia was frequent in children under the age of 2, as Gaza residents still reeled from 4 major Israeli assaults in the last 5 years. The siege had become the new normal. However, it was not in Gaza, but in occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's strategy of peace without peace, or perpetual occupation management, would face the first major disruption that summer. Negotiations over the US-led framework for a two-state solution broke down in late April, in part because Economic Minister Naftali Bennett, who is, as a side note, now Benjamin Netanyahu's replacement, Naftali Bennett of the religious nationalist Jewish Home Party, a key junior partner in Netanyahu's governing coalition, threatened to bolt from the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu if Netanyahu agreed to give U.S. demands to release a fourth batch of Palestinian prisoners. Netanyahu acceded to the radical right-wing pressure, authorizing the construction of hundreds of new settlement units to mollify his junior partners while flouting the demand to release prisoners. U.S. negotiator and longtime Israel lobbyist Martin Indyk, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Martin regarded Netanyahu's actions as flagrant perfidy. He turned to Nahum Barnea, one of Israel's most influential columnists, to anonymously blame Netanyahu's government for destroying the negotiations. Indyk later made his views public. Within weeks, the U.S. negotiating team had moved out of its luxury suites in Jerusalem, while Fatah and Hamas formed a unity government for which Washington offered its qualified endorsement. Rebuked by the Americans and defied by the Palestinians, Netanyahu and his inner circle reacted with outrage. Meanwhile, in Hebron, in the West Bank, a rogue Hamas cell decided to stage a kidnapping. The members likely hoped the operation would lead to the kind of prisoner swap Israel had just rejected in negotiations. Cell members Marwan Kawasmeh and Amar Abu Aisha had spent years in Israel prisons, subjected to prolonged isolation. Each had lost family members in the armed struggle against the occupation, and both were prepared to kill and die to achieve their desperate goals. On June 12th, Kawama and Abu Aisha set out in a stolen car from Hebron towards the busy crossroads in Gush Etzion in the occupied West Bank. 3 hitchhikers, students at a nearby yeshiva, entered the car, apparently believing the driver was an Israeli Jew like them. Hours later, they would be pronounced missing by the Israeli police. In callous acts of bloodletting and cynical deception that followed, the stage was set for the 51-day war. And I just want to apologize if I mispronounce anything. I've mentioned in my previous streams that I am dyslexic, so not everything is going to be pronounced accurately. Continuing, bound and gagged. The plan quickly unraveled when one of the students, Gilad Shar, was caught calling the Israeli police from his cell phone to report his abduction. Kawa Smeh and Abu Aisha shot the teens to death almost immediately, then buried their bodies in a shallow grave on property Kawasma's relative Hussam had purchased adjacent to his family's home in Hebron. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his National Security Council received news of the kidnapping in its immediate aftermath from the Shin Bet and police investigators. They huddled together and listened to the eerie phone call Shar placed to the police, in which the sound of gunshots and the kidnapper's celebratory singing was audible in the background. One of the killers can be heard exclaiming, "We got 3." Then they examined evidence gathered from inside the burned remnants of the kidnapper's stolen car. Blood, bullets, DNA, all signs pointed to the case of a triple homicide. Yet instead of announcing that the teens had been killed or releasing names of the suspects, which by that point they had in hand, then ordering a police action to catch them, Netanyahu engaged in an ambitious act of deception that set the stage for full-scale war. Just a moment. According to Bat Gilam Shar, Gilad's mother, police investigators convinced her that her son was still alive, insisting that gunshots she heard in the recorded call he placed to police were actually blanks. She was not informed that blood and bullets were found throughout the vehicle. When Israeli officials told me finally at 6 a.m. Friday that the army was on the job, I felt better, as if we were in good hands. Bat Galam Shar told Israel's Channel 10, quote, I was naive. I told everyone Gilad would be home for Shabbat before Shabbat. Not only had Netanyahu and the investigators hidden key facts from the mothers of the teens, they concealed the details of the case from the entire Israeli public, setting themselves up for a catastrophic reaction when the truth was finally revealed. The Israeli military imposed a gag order on the investigation, threatening journalists with legal repercussions if they reported a single detail of it. According to the text of the gag order, the military had forbidden Israeli reporters from publicizing, quote, all the details of the investigation, end quote, and, quote, all details that might identify the suspect, end quote. London-based Arabic language news site Rai Al Yaoum, which was not subject to the gag order, reported that Israeli police and Shin Bet agents had raided the homes of Kawasmeh and Abu Aisha, the main suspects, near the southern West Bank city of Hebron as early as June 17th, but the Israeli media did not report this crucial piece of information, which might have altered Jewish Israeli society's understanding of the crime. Hamas leadership had no knowledge of the kidnapping when it took place and played no role in its orchestration. The family of the ringleader, Kawasmeh, was known for going rogue, acting in direct contravention of Hamas ceasefires with Israel over the years. Though Israeli police spokesman Mickey Rosenfeld later admitted to the BBC's John Dennison that the killers represented a, quote, lone cell, end quote, Netanyahu was not about to allow the facts that the case interfere with what seemed like a prime political opportunity. The prime minister's target was not the teens' killers, but the new Palestinian Unity government. The hashtag Bring Back Our Boys is at the end of this page. On June 17th, the Israeli army forcibly confiscated security cameras from a shopkeeper in Betunia. The captured footage of its soldiers killing two unarmed Palestinian boys during a Nakba Day protest a month before. The same day, Israeli permanent representative to the United Nations, Ron Prozor, appeared behind a lectern in the UN mission in New York City. Quote, it has been 5 days since our boys went missing, Prozor thundered. Quote, and I ask the international community, where are you? Where are you? End quote. Referring to the Fatah-Hamas unity government, Prozor added, quote, all those in the international community who rushed to bless this marriage should look into the eyes of the heartbroken parents and have the courage to take responsibility by condemning the kidnapping. The international community bought into a bad deal, and Israel is paying for it. Beside Prozor stood a large placard displaying the smiling faces of the three missing teens beneath a Twitter hashtag that read, hashtag Bring Back Our Boys. Israel's propaganda blitz was in full swing. 4 days, leaders of Israel's trained online propaganda brigades, from the Israeli Army spokesperson's unit to the Jewish agency, located in the Prime Minister's office, flooded social media with the hashtag Bring Back Our Boys, mimicking Michelle Obama's promotion of the Bring Back Our Girls hashtag, launched to raise awareness of the kidnapping of Nigerian schoolgirls by Islamist militants. Pro-Israel social media networks disseminated an image of Netanyahu's wife, Sarah, frowning and bearing a placard that read, hashtag Bring Back Our Boys. The social media campaign reverberated throughout Jewish communities across the United States, as synagogues around the country displayed yellow ribbons in a coordinated show of solidarity with the missing teens. In New York City, local politicians appeared at pro-Israel rallies, while American diplomats from Secretary of State John Kerry to U.S. Ambassador to the UN Samantha Power to National Security Advisor Susan Rice, competed with one another to deliver the most emotional tribute to the kidnapped teens. Rachel Frankel, the mother of the kidnapped student Naftali Frankel, was junketed by the Israeli government to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland, to plead for help from the international community in rescuing her son. She was sent abroad in spite of the fact that Netanyahu and his inner circle knew that the teens were almost certainly dead. All this was made possible by the Israeli military's gag order, which even foreign correspondents honored. Brother's Keeper. With the public in a frenzy over the missing teens, the military had all the political latitude it needed to rampage through the West Bank cities and towns starting on June 15th, even if they were far from the scene of the crime. As far as the Israeli public knew, the kidnappers could have been anywhere in the West Bank, any schoolhouse or coffee house or hen house where anyone remotely affiliated with Hamas congregated. So began Operation, quote, Brother's Keeper, end quote, with thousands of Israeli troops storming into private homes and making mass arrests. The army claimed to be engaged in a rescue operation, a desperate hunt for the missing teens. In reality, it was the targeting of organization that Netanyahu had held collectively responsible for the crime, Hamas, rounding up hundreds of its members, including scores of those released under the 2011 prisoner swap that the captive soldier Gilad Shalit, Qadir Adnan, and Samar Asawi, two prisoners who had earned hero status in the Palestinian society for their successful hunger strikes, were among those rearrested. In the process, Israel closed off the entire area around Hebron, trapping some 680,000 people inside the military cordon. During the raid of Birzeit University in Ramallah on June 19th, Israeli troops seized hundreds of Hamas flags, carting them away in trucks as though they had obtained valuable evidence in the kidnapping case. A poll released on July 2nd revealed that 76% of Jewish Israelis approved of the army's actions. 76% of Jewish Israelis approved of the army's actions and expressed overwhelming support for Shin Bet's efforts to recover the teens. As the raids in the West Bank continued with overt cooperation from the Palestinian Authority security services, forces trained and armed by the United States to suppress native resistance to the occupation. Journalist Alison Dager reported Israeli soldiers and PA security officers, quote, working in armed conjunction to suppress Palestinian protesters, end quote. On July 22nd, Hamas leadership watched with consternation. Their political cadres were being herded into prison cells without criminal charges, and all they could do was watch. For them, Operation Brother's Keepers was an act of war. All along, the bodies of the three murdered Israeli teens lay in a shallow grave on the Kawasme property outside Halhul, just over 15 kilometers from the site of the kidnapping. They lay there for 18 days, somehow eluding the advanced monitoring capabilities of the Israeli satellites, surveillance cameras, police investigators, and the vast informant network the Shin Bet operated in the West Bank. The longer the teens' bodies decayed, the more rapidly Israeli society lost its composure. A spontaneously created Facebook page demanded the execution of one Palestinian prisoner for each hour the teens remained missing, while another called, quote, the people of Israel demand revenge, garnered more than 35,000 members, most of whom were young Israelis, in just a few days. When at 6 p.m. on June 20th, a team of soldiers and civilian volunteers happened upon the hitchhikers' bodies, the bloodlust seething just below the surface of Israeli society exploded into the open. That was chapter 1. We've done the first chapter as well as the introduction. I still have energy to keep going. It's only been 35 minutes, so we'll continue. Chapter 2 is called Human Animals. Polls of Jewish Israeli opinion taken after the discovery of the bodies of the three teens that summer showed Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu under mounting pressure. Economics Minister Naftali Bennett, a youthful and political savvy tech industry millionaire who had almost single-handedly brought the hardline Jewish Home Party out of the margins and into the mainstream, was gaining in the polls. For his part, Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman had begun drumming up a full reoccupation of the Gaza Strip. The scenario the military intelligence establishment considered a recipe for disaster, having already set the stage for the crisis by blocking the release of Palestinian prisoners. The two would remain a thorn in Netanyahu's right side throughout June and the days of early July leading up to the 51-day war, provoking him relentlessly towards inflammatory rhetoric and escalated violence. When Netanyahu issued his first official statement of the discovery of the teens' bodies on June 30th, he betrayed how much the far-right agitators had aroused his latent radicalism. In remarks delivered to an emergency cabinet meeting and relayed to the world through Twitter, Netanyahu declared that the teens had been, quote, abducted and murdered by human animals, end quote. He continued with a clear call for tribal revenge, quote, vengeance for the blood of a small child Satan has not yet created. Neither has vengeance for the blood of the 3 pure youths who were on their way home to meet their parents, who will not see them anymore. Hamas is responsible, and Hamas will pay. End quote. Continuing. Netanyahu's comments perplexed outsiders, but for those embedded inside the tight confines of Jewish Israeli life, they carried a familiar resonance. His statements alluded to the final stanza of a poem by the Hebrew writer Chaim Balik titled, quote, On the Slaughter. In Balik's verse, a Syrian lament anchored in biblical language, the poet dramatizes the brutal 1903 pogrom incited by Russian officials that left scores of Jews dead in the town of Kishinev. Bialik followed his first account of the Kishinev massacre with the city of slaughter. That's a quote, the city of slaughter. An incendiary poem admonishing the victims of the pogrom for their supposed passivity in the face of armed marauders. Parentheses, reports of fierce resistance by the Jews there were overlooked. End parentheses. This second poem helped radicalize thousands of young Jews across Eastern Europe, inspiring the formation of self-defense committees and winning waves of adherence to the militant wing of Zionism. Among the most influential by Balik was Vladimir Jabotinsky, the right-wing Zionist activist who would later become the political mentor to the prime minister's father, Benzion Netanyahu, who served him as the secretary. In Netanyahu's demagogic appropriation of Balik's verse, the, quote, human animals, end quote, of Palestine had inherited the general spirit of the Tsar's mobs and would repeat their crimes unless Jews were prepared to fight to the finish. Having manipulated the public into believing the teens were alive, he now spurred them to blood vengeance because they were dead. Within hours, mobs of Jewish youths filled the squares of central Jerusalem chanting, quote, death to Arabs. As a side note, we've heard this chant repeated throughout the streets of Israel and with increasing regularity in recent months. I could go in more detail, but I'd rather continue reading this. Quote, death to Arabs, end quote, and searching for Palestinians to assault. The, quote, ultras, end quote, who compromised the hardcore fan base of Jerusalem's Beitar soccer club, provided experienced muscle to the demonstrations. As active duty Israeli soldiers took to Facebook to demand revenge, posting photos of themselves with the weapons they said they were aching to use, political upstarts rushed to issue calls for the, quote, annihilation, end quote, of Hamas. Ayelet Shaked, the telegenic 38-year-old politician and poster girl for the right-wing Jewish Home Party, earned thousands of Facebook likes from mostly young Israelis when she declared that Palestinians are, quote, all enemy combatants, end quote, including, quote, the mothers of the martyrs who send them to hell with flowers and kisses. They should follow their sons. Nothing would be more just, end quote. Shakad continued, quote, they should go, as should the physical homes in which they raised the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there, end quote. Though more restrained than Shaked, the grand old man of Israel's so-called, quote, peace camp, and the 90-year-old president of Israel, Shimon Peres, used the funeral of the three teens as a platform to call for the Israeli army to, quote, act with a heavy hand until terror is uprooted, end quote. Joining Peres on the dais was Netanyahu, who bellowed, quote, a broad moral gulf separates us from our enemies. They sanctify death, we sanctify life. They sanctify cruelty, we sanctify compassion, end quote. Rabbi Noam Perel, the Secretary General of World B'nai Akiva, the world's largest religious Zionist youth movement, upped the ante when he called for turning the Israeli military to an army of avengers. Quote, that will not stop at 300 Philistine foreskins, end quote. Akiva's appeal alludes to the first book of Samuel, in which the biblical character David kills 200 Philistines and brings back their foreskins as evidence that he had done so. As ultranationalist mobs gathered in cities across Israel, a small car entered the back streets of Shuafat, a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. Behind its darkened windows rode three young men. They were on the hunt for Arab boys. This next section is called The Wrong Family. The stately stone homes of Shuafat line a four-lane boulevard that serves as the main artery between the major block settlements like Civic Pasgat, Se'ev, and central Jerusalem. The steel tracks of Jerusalem's light rail system bisect the road, shepherding thousands of settlers through the Palestinian neighborhood each day, along with the private security guards hired to protect them. Shuafat's light rail stop bristles with security cameras installed by the Jerusalem municipality, another reminder of the endless occupation. To ease settlers' path through the neighborhood, the municipality had begun to build a new access road that slices directly through the olive groves lining the hillsides of Shuafat. Among the neighbors, there is talk that the road represents the first step towards the seizure of their land and perhaps their expulsion as well. On a corner of Shuafat's main road across the narrow lane from the local mosque is the home of Abu Qadir's family. Mohammed Abu Qadir, a rail-thin 16-year-old student at the Amal High School, wandered from inside his home and perched himself on a stone wall facing the road through the olive groves. It was an early morning on July 2nd, just hours after the conclusion of the three Israeli teens' funeral. Young men approached Abu Qadir to ask for directions. As soon as he was within reach, they grabbed him and threw him in their car, then sped away. A group of locals attempted to give chase but failed to reach the vehicle for the summon help quickly enough to stop it. Later that day, Abu Qadir's charred body was found in the woods near Gavat Shal. He had been bludgeoned, unconscious, doused with gasoline, and burned alive. The crime contained all the signs of a Jewish nationalist revenge killing. Still, members of the Israeli media proceeded to insinuate otherwise, printing slanderous disinformation possibly leaked by the Israeli police that suggested Abu Qadir, I really hope I'm pronouncing that right, that suggested Abu Qadir was the victim of an honor crime, killed by a member of his own family for supposed homosexual activity. According to several members of Abu Qadir's family I interviewed, the Israeli police threatened to, quote, ruin the lives, end quote, of the young men who attempted to chase down the killer's car, then sought interrogation sessions with the family members of Abu Qadir's immediate family. While Netanyahu expressed shame over the murder, it was too late to contain the violence he had helped incite. The ringleader of Abu Qadir's three killers, a 30-year-old resident of a nearby Jewish settlement of Adam named Yusef Chaim Ben David, had been arrested along with 5 other suspects on July 6th. Yet his name and the details of his crimes he had confessed remained concealed behind a gag order for 11 days. It was only July 17th that the public received confirmation of the killers' motives, learning that they had been riled to action after the anti-Arab revenge rallies that had spilled out into the streets of Jerusalem. When the teens' bodies were discovered, and that they had vandalized 20 cars in nearby Beit Hanina and attempted to kidnap a 9-year-old Palestinian boy before abducting Abu Qadir. When Ben David appeared in the courtroom for his arraignment, he was flanked by lawyers from Hanenu, a radical settler outfit notorious for defending Jewish terror suspects. Quote, "I am the Messiah," he bellowed, reinforcing the insanity plea his defense team had filed. At the time of this writing, no verdict has been issued in the case. I'm not sure what the current state of that case is. Once again, the Israeli government's manipulations had accelerated the chaos. By the time Ben David was finally brought to court, rioting had plotted in Shuafat, leaving the light rail station that served as a conduit for settlers in ruins. At Mohammed Abu Qadir's funeral, a few weeks before the arraignment, gunshots rang out from rooftops as mourners chanted, "Intifada, Intifada." From then on, a nightly police detail would occupy the sidewalks outside Abu Qadir's family's home. Among the 25 members of the extended family thrown in jail since the chaos began was Tariq Abu Qadir, a 15-year-old Palestinian-American teen badly beaten by Israeli police. Tariq Abu Qadir's case earned widespread attention when his neighbors in Shuafat provided media outlets with the security camera footage they had recorded of the beatings. The storm of the press and the international coverage prompted the U.S. Department of State to intervene, eventually spurring Tariq Abu Qadir's release on July 6th. Days later, beneath the cover of darkness, Israeli police ransacked his cousin's home in Shuafat, an apparent act of revenge for publicizing the security camera video. The authorities seemed determined to punish the pesky Abu Qadir family at all costs. This next section is called In the Tent. In August, a month after Muhammad's murder, I spent a day with the members of Abu Qadir's family outside their stately stone home in Shuafat. We sat on the plastic chairs beneath a tarp just a few feet from the ledge where the teen was kidnapped, and directly beside the family's mourning tent. Outside the home was a giant poster of a vulnerable-looking Muhammad that city authorities would later compel the family to remove. It was here that the family received a stream of visitors, from Palestinian dignitaries to random Jews from around the world, venturing to their home to express shame and sorrow for the murder of their son. The Abu Qadir family spans the Palestinian diaspora, with relatives across the United States and in Venezuela and Bolivia, as well as around the Middle East. All of them are descendants of the same patriarch. They are his great-great-grandchildren. My American journalist colleague Dan Cohen had befriended Thawra Abu Qadir, a college undergrad from Georgia, who had spent the summer with her family in Shuafat. For his part, Dan was just starting out as a reporter for outlets like Vice and Mondoweiss. He had grown up in a conservative Jewish community in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, and had taken his first trip to Israel for his bar mitzvah. After returning to Israel on the Taglite birthright trip, a free vacation for college-aged diaspora Jews, he began to question the pro-Israeli indoctrination that seemed to be de rigueur for Jews of his generation. His disaffection soon developed into a curiosity about the situation of Palestinians. The faceless people who he had always heard described as either terrorists or a demographic threat. At the age of 28, he quit his job as a rope access repair technician in New York City buildings, on New York City buildings and industrial sites, and bought a ticket to Israel, Palestine. Within a matter of months, he was making contacts across occupied Palestine while learning how to write breaking stories and edit videos. Thanks to Dan's friendship with Thara, we were able to gain entry to the home of a family that felt deceived and smeared by the Israeli press, and which had sunk into a bunker mentality as a result. It had also helped Mohammed Abu Qadir's 28-year-old cousin, a longtime resident of California, who was also named Mohammed, recognized me from my articles and video documentaries. While over time Abu Qadir's family had grown wary of media, at that point it had formally rejected only one visitor, Shimon Peres, the then president who had attempted to pay condolences visit. Even before Perez arrived at the tent, Abu Qadir's family turned his security detail away. Portrayed in the international media as one of Israel's last doves, and presented by President Barack Obama with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Perez is reviled across the Arab world for presiding over the 1996 massacre in Qana, Lebanon, and the sordid Israeli assassination campaigns in the occupied territories during the mid-1990s. When Perez arrived from the family mourning tent, he was swiftly turned away. Quote, "We didn't want him," end quote. Mohammed Abu Qadir's 62-year-old father, Hossein, told me, quote, "Perez says he's a man of peace, but he's always making war. He doesn't really want peace," end quote. The family was unable to dispatch the Labor Party stalwart from the former Army Major Amir Peretz when he arrived at the mourning tent unannounced. When Peretz came, he barged in without advance notice, surrounded by bodyguards. 28-year-old 28-year-old Mahmoud, 28-year-old Muhammad Abu Qadir recalled, quote, "We saw him sitting down next to Hussein Abu Qadir out of nowhere. If it was a normal Israeli citizen, then fine, but this guy was in the government and supports the killing of Palestinians, so he wasn't very welcome. He took a couple of pictures and then he left. He just wanted to show that he was here," end quote. For Peretz, the meeting had serious consequences, as he was bombarded with death threats and hate mail from right-wing Israeli Jews. Like many of their neighbors in Shuafat, the Abu Qadir family was no stranger to discrimination. After spending years of savings he had set aside as an electrician to expand his property on the land he owned, Hussein Abu Qadir told me he was fined 100,000 shekels, about 40,000 USD, by a municipal court, ostensibly for building without a permit. Unfortunately for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, obtaining a permit for the municipal government is next to impossible, forcing them to build under circumstances the authorities consider illegal. In many cases, their homes are demolished as punishment. Quote, "I'm not allowed to build on my own land just because it's not included in their plan," end quote. He remarked, quote, "If it was a Jew who did what I did, I would have been fined maybe 3,000 shekels." End quote. Hussein said that the land behind his home had been expropriated by the city to build a public school, and that the city had begun uprooting family orchards in order to build new access roads for settlers leaving on land taken from their neighbors. Quote, "40% of my family's land is going to be taken just to build settlers a shortcut," end quote. 28-year-old Muhammad exclaimed. Near the grave of Mohammed Abu Qadir was that of another murdered family member. In 2009, a Jewish Israeli murdered Amjad Abu Qadir in a random racist act. According to the family members, the killer was allowed to file an insanity plea that let him off with the lightest possible sentence. Quote, "It's not just our family that's at risk. Every family here in the occupied areas has lost someone," end quote, Hussein Abu Qadir had said. "Just days before I met the Abu Qadirs, two of their friends, from nearby Beit Hanina, 20-year-olds Amir Shawaki and Samer Mahfouz, were beaten by a mob of pipe and baseball bat wielding settlers in central Jerusalem. 10 young Jewish nationalists were said to have beaten the young man nearly to death, but none of them had been sentenced at the time of this writing. Quote, everyone's scared to let their kids out because at any moment a settler could take your kids and just keep going. End quote, Thara Abu Qadir had said. Among the young men I had spoke to in the neighborhood, particularly within Mohammed Abu Qadir's teenage clique, the fear of entering Jewish areas of Jerusalem was universal. And in the neighborhood, the teens made a point of traveling in groups to avoid abductions. Whatever segregation the Israeli-run local government had failed to establish in the supposedly, quote, united Jerusalem, gangs of vigilante Jewish nationalists were enforcing. The regime of segregation was radicalizing an entire generation and deepening a crisis for which the government seemed to have no solution. This next section of this chapter is called The Other. The Other. Seated under the tarp with us was a young white American woman who had just enrolled in Islamic studies at Hebrew University. She wore a keffiyeh around her neck and spoke with unrestrained resentment about the Jaish, a Palestinian Arabic term for the Israeli army, and identified as a member of Abu Qadir's family. Yet she was a Mormon from Salt Lake City, Utah, named Alyssa. I was confused. How in the world had she wound up here, in the midst of this roiling cauldron? Like many Mormons, Alyssa had taken an interest in her genealogy. Through a DNA test, she had learned that she was related to an Arab-American family in Washington, D.C. After contacting them, she learned that her great-grandfather was a Palestinian immigrant named Abu Qadir who had married a white Christian woman in the 1930s. The couple was forced to give up their son for adoption to a Mormon family in Salt Lake City under harsh pressure from the wife's racist family. Learning about her Palestinian roots prompted Alyssa to study Arabic and plunge into Islamic studies and make contact with her extended family to, quote, bring some closure, as she explained. Wow. That's wild. That's a wild bit of information. Just a moment, I have to check my phone. I apologize. Continuing. Alyssa was on the flight to Jerusalem with her cousin, Thawra, from Georgia. On her way to spend the summer with her family in Shuafat, Alyssa had no idea what she was in for when she landed at Ben Gurion International Airport. As soon as Alyssa arrived with her veiled Palestinian cousin, she was taken aside by airport security and seated in what Palestinians call, quote, the Arab room. I grew up white and middle class in America, Alyssa reflected. Quote, I'm privileged over there, and other than the fact that I am a woman, I have a full deck of cards. I come here, and all of a sudden, I'm the other. My cousin's a hijabi, and when they see her, they take me aside at the airport and detain me for 5 hours and feel me up while I am topless. Why? As the airport person said, to find the Muslim connection. End quote. Alyssa emerged from the airport nightmare to experience the daily discrimination that pervades life in Shuafat. Quote, when I am with her, she said, pointing to Thawra, quote, the soldiers will be calling her profanities and beating her up. And then, in the next breath, they turn to me and ask me about my emotional well-being. Then when I tell them I am her cousin, I suddenly become the wrong race. It has been a deeply radicalizing experience for Alyssa, and unlike most of the youth who grew up under the regime of discrimination, she has another frame of reference. Quote, it's really hard coming here, end quote. She said as tears in her hazel eyes welled up, quote, I find myself crying here, and it's frustrating because there's nothing I can do. Gaza's 60 miles away, and there isn't a damn thing I can do about it. end quote. An hour after my visit with Abu Qadir's parents, I received a phone call from members of the family informing me that the police had burst into the property to arrest a 19-year-old cousin of theirs on the grounds that he had participated in illegal demonstrations. This next section is called Over the Cliff. The killing of Abu Qadir and the subsequent rebellion in East Jerusalem was a triggering point in the events that led up to the war in Gaza. On July 6th, 2 days after Abu Qadir's funeral, armed factions in the Gaza Strip launched a heavy barrage of rockets into southern Israel. Though rockets had battered southern Israel from Gaza for days, Hamas took no credit for the attacks up until this point. When Israel responded with airstrikes that killed 7 Hamas members the following day, Hamas took credit for the rocket salvo into southern Israel. On July 8th, the Is ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades, Hamas's military wing, launched long-range M75 rockets towards Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. As Shuafat residents poured out of their homes at the sound of rocket warning sirens, cheers erupted and cries of Allahu Akbar erupted from the streets. Alison Dejir, a correspondent from Mondoweiss, was at Abu Qadir's home at the time. Outside the house, she told me she watched a young woman squeeze the hand of another as they watched the bright glow of an M75 sail overhead. Quote, "That rocket's for Muhammad," end quote. The woman said, staring at the sky with astonishment. The Israeli army had been planning a major ground and aerial assault against the Gaza Strip since late 2013. On December 31st of that year, Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon had announced the operation that the Israeli army would be required to undertake would have to deal a harsh blow to Gaza and to the organizations operating there in a way that would damage their capabilities and exact a heavy toll. On July 8th, Netanyahu gathered his entire cabinet to announce the beginning of Operation Protective Edge. Just a brief side note, the organization I work with, Palestinians, Nevadans for Palestinian Human Rights, just did a sort of feed the houseless action where we went around Las Vegas and distributed goods based on certain facts surrounding Operation Protective Edge. So we commemorated this massacre that we're about to, I believe, speak about. Continuing, the operation's Hebrew name, Mivtza Tzuk Aitan, translates literally to English as Strong Cliff. I don't believe we're actually going to speak at length about Operation Protective Edge, but if you want more information on that, I'll go back into my Facebook page right now and my Twitter page as well, and retweet that so you can get some basic information as to the nature of Operation Protective Edge, because I feel that it's important. Many people were killed for seemingly no reason. It's going to take me a second to find this, so I do apologize for the interruption. Let me see if I can do this a quicker way from my phone. Because it may not seem important to distract from the book, but it is very important that people know about Operation Protective Edge, as well as the work that we're doing in Nevada and Las Vegas. So on my personal Twitter page, I've just retweeted the action we did for, actually this is Operation Cast Lead, not Protective Edge. I apologize. Got a little confused there. So now we'll continue with Chapter 3. Chapter 3, The Resistance. By July 16th, 8 days after a relentless aerial bombardment of the Gaza Strip, on day 9 of the 51-day war, The Palestinian death toll stood around 200. Excuse me. Among the dead were 8 members of the Kawar family, who were killed in the southern city of Khan Yunis by a guided Israeli missile. They had re-entered their home after momentarily evacuating, only to have the house collapse on their bodies. The Israeli military initially claimed the bombing was a mistake, yet ultimately justified it on the basis of the family's alleged affiliation with Hamas. Another Israeli missile struck the beachside Funtime Beach Cafe south of the city, where 9 young men who had gathered during an electricity outage in Khan Yunis to watch the World Cup were blasted to pieces. Quote, and the result of this match here? The Jews won 9-0, end quote. One of the survivors, Ahmad al-Akkad, remarked to Agence France Presse afterwards. On July 16th, Israeli naval gunboats lobbed a shell towards a group of young boys. This story is very disturbing. I'm familiar with it. On July 16th, Israeli naval gunboats lobbed a shell towards a group of young boys playing on the beach. Journalists assembled at the Al Diera Hotel restaurant watched in astonishment from the 200 meters away. As the boys ran from the explosions for the safety of the hotel, they waved for help from the journalists. The Israeli gunners readjusted their sights to lob another shell at the boys, all members of the Fatah-aligned Bakar family that earned its keep in Gaza's fishing industry. Quote, they are only children, end quote, a group of reporters shouted. Quote, in the space of 40 seconds, 4 boys who had been playing hide-and-seek among fishermen's shacks on the wall were dead, end quote, wrote Peter Baymon, a correspondent for The Guardian who witnessed the incident. Footage of the shelling captured by dozens of photographers and camera people on the scene made it one of the war's most iconic moments, transforming the 4 Bakar boys and their failed flight to safety into a symbol of the young lives cut short by Israeli violence. To date, 1 Israeli had died in the rocket salvos launched by Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, the guerrilla group that functioned as the military arm of Hamas. The Al-Qassam brigades operated cells within the West Bank and in Jerusalem, where affiliates could be activated at a moment's notice to carry out deadly attacks on Israeli and civilian targets. But the organization's strategy had changed since it fell under the control of a new breed of leaders intent on developing its military capacity to compete in the field with the best of Israeli special forces. The bus bombings and random shootings of the past were no longer a priority. Al-Qassam now focused its most lethal force on the military targets, aiming to humiliate Israel's ground forces in a face-to-face confrontations. The Al-Qassam brigades drew its ideological inspiration from the days of the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 1939 and the British Mandate for Palestine, naming itself after Izz ad-Din al-Qassam. The Al-Qassam was a militant Islamic preacher and veteran of the anti-colonial agitation in Libya and Syria, and was based in Haifa in northern Palestine. There, he served as a functionary in the local Shia court and helped lead the Young Men's Muslim Association, offering him direct access to the masses of dispossessed peasants pouring into the city. Many of the impoverished farmers had been run off the land they rented from absentee landlords by the Jewish National Fund. So Al-Qassam found no shortage of eager recruits among them from the Black Hand cells he organized to carry out armed attacks on British and Zionist targets. Killed in a dramatic shootout with British forces in 1935, where he was said to have exhorted his men to fight to the last bullet and accept their martyrdom with zeal, Al-Qassam became a symbol of defiance for Islamist and secular Palestinians alike. For Hamas, his legacy represented the cultivation of grassroots support through a blend of social welfare programs, religious ardor, and anti-colonial resistance. Al-Qassam began organizing its original nucleus of fighters in the mid-1980s, recruiting up on university campuses and cultivating young members in the growing network of Hamas-affiliated mosques. It drew its most enthusiastic cadres from impoverished youth orphaned and otherwise scarred by Israeli violence, promising them a chance at retribution and an honored place in society. By 1991, Al-Qassam brigades had just a single rifle, a 1960s era millimeter Carl Gustav M45 submachine gun that barely functioned. Bullets fell from its barrel to the ground once the weapon heated up. Without the capacity to confront Israeli soldiers directly to attack the settlements in northern Gaza, most al-Qassam without the capacity to confront Israeli soldiers directly or to attack the settlements in northern Gaza, most al-Qassam attacks were aimed at the collaborators, the Palestinians who had been compromised or induced into spying on fellow Palestinians. Al-Qassam's offensive capacity progressed with the development of homemade rockets and the ability to shell settlements with mortars. The collaborators enabled Israel's Shin Bet intelligence service to pick off its leaders one by one. Ahmad Akel, an early commander of the Al-Qassam Brigade's original cell, spent 2 years as a fugitive after an audacious and lethal attack in 1992 on Israeli settlers in Hebron. After spilling back into Gaza from the West Bank disguised as a Jewish settler, he hid out in a tunnel under his home before a collaborator gave up his location, leading to his death at the age of 22. Akel's successor Yahya Ayash was an explosives expert known as, quote, the engineer, who was also a master of disguise. He attended the funeral of a comrade dressed as a woman when American-born Jewish fanatic Baruch Goldstein massacred 29 Palestinian worshippers at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron on February 25, 1994. Ayash stepped up the Al-Qassam Brigade's campaign of revenge, initiating a wave of suicide bombings that tormented Israeli society. After a frenzied search by the Shin Bet, Israel's intelligence services finally caught up with the elusive engineer in 1996. He was killed at a safe house when one of his best friends passed him a mobile phone that turned out to be packed with explosives by a collaborator, his friend's uncle. The charge was detonated by an Apache helicopter hovering in the area. Ayash was succeeded by Salah Shadeh, a skilled guerrilla organizer who died in 2002 when Israeli F-16 dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on the apartment compound where his family resided, killing him and 14 others, including 7 children. As in the past, a collaborator had given up Shahadeh's location. Both Ayash and Shahadeh's assassinations occurred during the periods of truce between Hamas and Israel, and led to severe interruptions of the peace process. For 2 months, Ayash had abided by an agreement to cease attacks on Israeli targets when the then Prime Minister Shimon Peres, a figure widely identified with Israel's so-called peace camp, authorized his killing. The attack disillusioned many moderate Hamas members in the territories who were willing to give the peace process a chance. International relations professor Alon Ben-Meir wrote at the time, quote, "It has embarrassed the Palestinian Authority and undermined Chairman Yasser Arafat's credibility," end quote. During the height of the Second Intifada 6 years later, Israel made the decision to kill Shahadah, as Palestinian factions introduced a proposal for a unilateral ceasefire aimed at returning to negotiations. The killing reinforced the perception among Hamas's political leadership that negotiations with Israel were fruitless. It was under the leadership of Mohammed al-Daif, who took over Shahadah's assassination and took over after Shahadah's assassination in 2002. The Al-Qassam brigades began to transition away from the kind of suicide operations on civilian targets overseen by Ayash. Daif took extreme measures to cover his life in a veil of secrecy. He did not use a cell phone, preferring instead to relay verbal messages through a handful of close associates. He never appeared in public, not even to attend his own mother's funeral. Born as Mohammed Diab Ibrahim al-Masri, He was nicknamed Daif, or guest in Arabic, because he was constantly on the run from Israeli assassination plots, making him a perpetual guest in homes across Gaza. I paused right here at his last name, al-Masri. Palestinian last names are very common, but there was a little girl around the age of 4 who was killed a month or so ago, named Rahaf al-Masri. And I don't know if there's a relation there. It's unlikely, but I remember her face. Continuing, Israeli intelligence was at least as obsessed with eliminating Daif as it was with his forerunners, attempting to kill him at least 5 times. The closest it came to assassinating Daif before Operation Protective Edge was in 2002, when an Apache helicopter found him driving through the Sheikh Radwan neighborhood of Gaza City. Daif's driver was killed, but Daif managed to emerge from the burning wreck. The culminative attempts on Daif's life had left him blind in one eye and partly immobilized, only able to walk for short distances. When Daif escaped to Egypt to receive medical care for his injuries, his role was filled by another veteran Hamas Qadir named Ahmad Jabari. Jabari had proven indispensable in Daif's absence, continuing the transformation of al-Qassam into a professional guerrilla force along the same lines as Hezbollah, a goal he shared with Daif. Jabari masterminded the daring tunnel operation that brought the Israeli soldiers in Gilad Shalit into captivity on June 25th, 2006, prompting the deal 5 years later with Israel that led to the release of more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. The swap was arguably the most substantial concession any Palestinian faction had extracted from Israel since the Camp David negotiations collapsed in 2000. Despite his widely reported role in negotiating several ceasefire agreements and in overseeing the safe release of Shalit, Jabari wound up at the top of the Shin Bet's target bank. During the November 2012 military escalation in Gaza known as Operation Pillar of Defense, the Israeli stalemate that saw Israel attack Gaza exclusively by air, Israeli assassinated Jabari in a targeted airstrike. Daif, who had returned to Gaza through the tunnel from Egypt, was now in full command of al-Qassam and at the top of Shin Bet's hit list. Thanks to the ingenuity of Daif's late comrade Adnan al-Ghul, al-Qassam was able to initiate the local production of short-range rockets in the Yasin RPG-7 rocket launcher that remains at the forefront of the organization's arsenal. I do not know if that is still the case in present day, as this was written in 2014. I do believe that the al-Qassam brigades have increased their military capacity somewhat significantly. Continuing, al-Qassam even began exploring I'll go back a little bit. Thanks to the ingenuity of Daif's late comrade Adnan al-Ghul, al-Qassam was able to initiate the local production of short-range rockets in the Yasin RPG-7 rocket launcher that remains at the forefront of the organization's arsenal. Al-Ghul was assassinated by the Israeli military in 2004. Under al-Ghul's watch, al-Qassam even began exploring plans to develop weaponized drones, an effort that was finally realized during Operation Protective Edge when the group flew its first drone over Israeli territory. By 2012, al-Qassam boasted that locally made long-range rockets like the M75 and the R160 could reach centrally located Israeli cities. During the military escalations that took place in Gaza that year, rockets struck Tel Aviv, marking the first missile attack on the city in 20 years. The rockets did literal structural damage. They shook the psyche of Israeli society and fostered a sense of redress to the Palestinians withstanding the brunt of the Middle East's most powerful military. During the 2012 escalation, a fast-paced pop song with a taunting tone thumped from shops and cars from Ramallah to Gaza City. Conceived by a popular wedding singer from the West Bank, Qassem El Najjar, the song was called Bomb Bomb Tel Aviv. This next section is called PSYOPs. Songs like these were almost as useful to al-Qassam as its arsenal of long-range rockets. As long as Israel remained the favored client of the West, Palestinian armed factions had little chance of defeating its military in a head-to-head confrontation. Through psychological warfare, however, it could at least disrupt Israel's sense of invulnerability and control it enjoyed over daily Palestinian life. Catchy pop songs trumpeting armed resistance to occupation proliferated as Gaza as the assault in Gaza increased. When the 51-day war began, a new resistance anthem called Zalzil Amna Israel, or Shake the Peace of Israel, exploded in popularity across Palestine. It was promptly re-recorded in native-level Hebrew to ensure that its mocking lyrics entered the Israeli consciousness. Indeed, they are weak and doubtful. These are some of the lyrics. Indeed, they are weak and doubtful, with no spirit to fight. They are like the spider web. When facing strong people, shake the peace of Israel, burn down that state with fire. Continuing, during the war, few songs resonated with the youthful masses of Gaza as much as "Here We Prepare," a macho battle anthem delivered over a driving hip-hop inspired beat. It was sung by Ramzi al-Ak, a former prisoner of the Israeli jails who hailed from the Daesha refugee camp in the West Bank and was deported to Gaza in the swap that led to Gilad Shalit's release. Performed with a band of fellow ex-prisoners who had also been deported to Gaza after Shalit's deal and indefinitely confined there. The Basu Profondo al-Ak lionized the fighters who confronted Israeli forces in the border areas of Gaza. These are some of the lyrics. Here, we've prepared for you. Here, we've returned for revenge. Here, there are resisting men on the border lines. Here, there are men in the tunnels, hiding out. Come forward and wait for your grave. You'll see us torment you. Here, Gaza defeated you. Continuing, as the 51-day war took hold and leaders of Hamas's political wing disappeared into shelters and safe houses, a charismatic figure known as Abu Obaida was left as the voice and masked face of Gaza's guerrilla operations. Obaida was the main channel of psychological warfare against Israeli society and became one of the most identifiable symbols of Palestinian armed resistance, inspiring a popular song proclaimed, "Oh, Obaida, your words are gunpowder," end quote. And the spokesman for Al-Qassam, he was the ubiquitous figure during the war, launching verbal broadsides at the Israeli military during the regular press conferences and appearances on the Hamas-controlled Al-Aqsa TV, which were regularly translated and relayed to the Israeli public through Israel's Hebrew language media. In a 2009 interview with a British reporter, one of his few engagements with Western media, Al-Qassam generally spurned the Western media during wartime for security concerns, by the way. That's a parentheses. Obaida demonstrated a keen ability to cater to his audience. When he discussed Hamas's political goals, for instance, he did so in terms of rights guaranteed under international law and referred to Palestinians as a whole. Quote, "They are not asking to invade or ethnically cleanse another people. They are not asking to commit a Holocaust against another nation. They just want their rights," end quote. In the interview, Obaida denied any intention of imposing Islamic law on Israeli Jews, referring to a future regime of coexistence between Jews and Palestinians, and insisting that Al-Qassam intended to target members of the Israeli military and armed settlers. Quote, "We are fully committed to keeping civilians on both sides out of the conflict," end quote. And remember, this is the spokesperson for the Al-Qassam brigades. Back in 2014, around that time, talking about leaving citizens on both sides talking about Jews and Arabs living in coexistence peacefully. This is Hamas. So when you hear them being labeled as terrorist organizations, the terrorist organization, consider that. And consider everything we've read so far. I'm sorry, I wanted to just add that. Quote, "We are fully committed to keeping civilians on both sides out of the conflict," end quote. Obeida said, quote, "Civilian loss, whether on the side or that side, is something that is not good. It is not something that one can be happy about. But the picture has to be viewed wholly, and not from one small angle," end quote. Despite Obeida's prolific image, little was known about the masked man Palestinians had taken to calling the Ghost. Nicknamed after Abu Ubaida al-Jarrah, a companion of Prophet Muhammad, he was a PhD student at the Islamic University who had earned his master's degree in comparative religion. According to the London-based Al-Sharaq al-Awsat newspaper, when Israel's intelligence agency Mossad briefly hacked the Hamas-controlled Al-Aqsa TV channel in July, it broadcasted what it believed to be the face and real name of Obeida, Hosea Ifa Samir Abdullah al-Qaut. Al-Qassam never confirmed the veracity of this claim. When on July 17th, Israeli Minister of Defense Moshe Ya'alon announced the launch of the ground invasion in Gaza, Obeida took to the airwaves with a blood-curdling statement, quote, "Are you threatening us with what we expect you to do, you son of a Jewess?" End quote. He railed at Ya'alon, breaking from his usual protocol of referring to Israeli Jews as Zionists. Quote, "The bodies of your soldiers will litter the streets of Gaza, and the children of Palestine will step on your skulls." End quote. A dramatic clash was on the way that would test the advancement of the Al-Qassam against the Israeli army, willing to enact. Sorry, I'm going to reread that quote. A dramatic clash was on the way that would test the advancement of Al-Qassam against an Israeli army willing to act without restraint. But the violence might have been avoided had the US and the Egyptian regime been willing to entertain Hamas's ceasefire demands. This next section is called "The Road to the Status Quo Runs Through Cairo." Cairo being the capital of Egypt, for those who are unaware. Continuing. On July 16th, the day before Israel announced its ground invasion of Gaza, Hamas and the Palestinian political faction known as the Islamic Jihad released a list of demands for a 10-year truce, outlining details of their cause. The demands were entirely humanitarian in nature, relating to the lifting of the Israeli and Egyptian siege. Most notably, the factions called for international forces to guard Palestinians in Gaza from Israeli violence along the border areas. The demands were as follows: withdrawal of Israeli tanks from the Gaza border, freeing all the prisoners arrested after the killing of the 3 youths, lifting of the siege and opening the border crossings to commerce and people, establishing an international seaport and airport which would be under UN supervision, increasing the permitted fishing zone to 10 kilometers, internationalizing the Rafah crossing administered by the Egyptian regime and placing it under the supervision of the United Nations and some Arab nations. Placement of international forces on the borders, easing conditions for permits to pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque, prohibition of Israeli interference in the reconciliation agreement with Fatah, reestablishment of an industrial zone, and improvements in further economic development in the Gaza Strip. Days later, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry thrust himself into negotiations led by the regime of Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Sisi was the military strongman who had led a bloody coup against the democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated President Mohamed Morsi, and had only recently, quote, won an election, widely considered by international observers as undemocratic. While Sisi's regime jailed Muslim Brotherhood supporters, by the thousands, either summarily or after convictions in kangaroo courts. It incited against Palestinian refugees from Gaza, scapegoating them, and by extension Hamas, for the instability that gripped the country after the coup. Indeed, the Egyptian junta made little distinction between the Brotherhood and Hamas, aiming to put both out of business through all means available to it. When Sisi seized power in July 2013, he initiated close coordination with the Israeli military to tighten the siege on Gaza, prompting the Israeli lobby in Washington to pressure Congress not to cut off arms shipments to his regime. So zealous was Sisi in enforcing the siege that Israeli military administrators began to worry about overkill. Quote, they actually were suffocating Gaza too much, end quote, an Israeli official told the Wall Street Journal. Throughout the 51-day war, Cairo served as the site of negotiations between the Palestinian factions and representatives of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's inner circle over the cessation of hostilities. At every stage of the wrangling, Sisi and the Egyptian junta reinforced and even hardened Israel's position, demanding that the Hamas governors of Gaza accept an immediate ceasefire without any preconditions or guarantees of relief from the siege, while refusing to push Israel to halt its assassinations of Hamas leadership. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas did little to counter the Egyptian position and seemed convinced that undermining Hamas could bring his Fatah-controlled Palestinian Authority to the foothold it could not find in Gaza through popular election. Behind the main parties were the United States and the European Union, the Saudis, and the United Arab Emirates, the funders of Sisi's regime and the guarantors of his legitimacy. Together, these forces contrived to produce a deal that sent Gaza back into the suffocating grip of siege. When presented with Hamas Islamic Jihad proposals for an extended truce, Sisi and Kerry produced a document of their own that offered residents of the Gaza Strip a temporary cessation of hostilities without any humanitarian concessions, which Hamas demanded. Hamas has a fundamental choice to make, quote, Hamas has a fundamental choice to make, and it is the choice that will have profound impact for the people of Gaza, Kerry declared. Kerry's proposal did not really present a choice, rather. It was offered the option of returning to the status quo of siege and the occupation, or facing the full brunt of Israeli military. Soon after Israel and its international allies abruptly dismissed Hamas's demands, Israel armored personnel carriers from the Golani Brigade rumbled towards Shujaiya, a population center located just east of Gaza City. Awaiting them were teams of fighters huddled in tunnels and poised for a defensive guerrilla battle on friendly terrain. Chapter 4. Now this chapter, I don't know how long it is. It's a very dramatic chapter regarding the Battle of Shujaiya. It's 1:30. I've been streaming for an hour and 30 minutes. I believe we can get to this chapter. The Battle of Shujaiya. On July 8th, Al-Qassam offered a preview of the tactics it had cultivated under Jabari and Daif's leadership. A frogman team swam from Gaza to the Israeli naval base at Zakim and then attempted to storm the outpost from the sea. Although all members of the raiding team were killed, the Israeli army covered up details of the incident, which were later revealed in an elite internal army video showing that one member of the unit was able to plant an explosive device on a passing Israeli bulldozer, though the explosive charge caused no injuries. The fear of infiltrations from Gaza and sustained mortar and rocket fire prompted thousands of residents of southern kibbutzim to evacuate in fear. Quote, the kibbutz members said that as far as they are concerned, it is Hamas that is in control of the agenda and not Israel. And the situation does not allow routine life to continue. End quote. Haaretz reported this. 4 days later, an Al-Qassam unit managed to intercept a late-night landing by Israeli naval commandos at Sudanaya, a beachside city in northern Gaza. According to accounts from Hamas-related media, Al-Qassam fighters pinned down the commandos, forcing them to call in covering fire from Navy ships and Apache helicopters as they withdrew. The Israeli military claimed that 4 of its soldiers had only been lightly wounded before being evacuated to Israeli hospitals. When the Israelis poured ground troops into Shujair on July 20th, the Israeli spokesperson unit published a series of online graphics asserting that its forces were aiming to eliminate a vast terror fortress. Terror fortress is in quotes. The spokesperson unit claimed that Hamas had commanded Shujair residents to ignore orders to evacuate and therefore, quote, ordered them directly in the line of fire, end quote. It appeared that the Israeli military public relations arm was preparing for the fallout from the staggering amounts of civilian casualties its combat units might be causing. As Israeli soldiers took up positions in Shujair early that Sunday morning, Al-Qassam fighters in full battle dress uniform and balaclavas were stationed in the tunnels in small teams. They were supplemented by fighters from an array of factions, of whom the Palestinian Islamic Jihadist Al-Quds brigades were most numerous and well-armed, thanks to help from their Iranian sponsors. Back in October 1988, when Hamas was still in quietist mode and avoiding direct confrontations with Israeli occupation, an Al-Quds unit staged a headlong attack on the Israeli military in Shujair, killing 10 soldiers in a ferocious clash that became known as the Battle of Shujair. With Israeli soldiers back in Gaza City suburb 26 years later, Islamic Jihad Al-Quds brigades were back on the front lines, but this time as a supplement to the better-armed Al-Qassam. And alongside smaller factions like the Fatah-affiliated Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and the Popular Resistance Committees, as well as Abu Ali Mustafa Brigade on the leftist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is the PFLP for those who have been paying attention. On July 19th, 2014, the Second Battle of Shujair began. And here's a photo of Dan Cohen, the journalist. This is him up against the pillar in Shujair after the Israeli army destroyed it. The battle began after Israeli troops had situated themselves in densely populated neighborhoods. Teams had waited patiently before sallying forth from their tunnels, ambushing the Israeli soldiers with light weapons like AK-47s and the homemade rocket launchers like the Yasin. Sapper teams from Al-Qassam attacked. Again, this is the result of Israel invading Gaza. Sapper teams from Al-Qassam attacked armored vehicles, sometimes with nothing more than improvised explosive devices in their hands. In the past, Gaza's fighters had staged brief hit-and-run attacks, shrinking away when Israeli forces responded with massive firepower, but this time they pressed the attack, remaining engaged at distances of less than 15 meters, neutralizing the Israeli army's ability to call in air and artillery support, and shocking young soldiers who had never seen such intense combat. Making its debut in the Battle of Shujaiya was the Al Ghul, a homemade 14.5 millimeter sniper rifle named for Adnan Al Ghul, the assassinated Al-Qassam weaponsmith. The gun measured about 1.5 meters in length and was said to be able to hit long distance targets with devastating accuracy. Toted by masked snipers in swamp creature-style ghillie outfits, the gun embodied Al-Qassam heightened focus on engaging the Israeli military in head-to-head confrontations. A video produced by Al-Aqsa TV showed snipers using the gun to hit several Israeli soldiers, including an officer, while he was giving an order to fire from the turret of a Merkava tank. As the crackle of the rifle reverberated through the streets of Shujaiya, an Al-Qassam team lured an M113 armored personnel carrier into a field laced with improvised explosive devices that the Israelis had invaded using a thinly armored Vietnam-era American relic signaled their underestimation of Al-Qassam's capabilities. The vehicle went up in a ball of flames, killing 6 soldiers inside and badly wounding 1. Sergeant Aron Shaul, Al-Qassam fighters grabbed Shaul and quickly spirited him away, hoping to use the live soldier as a leverage in the ceasefire negotiations. In fear that Hamas would photograph the flaming wreck when daylight broke and broadcast the image around the world, the Israeli Army Command ordered an engineer unit into the neighborhood to remove the M113. The engineers panicked under the threat of fire from surrounding buildings and inadvertently drove over the bodies of their dead countrymen as they struggled to complete the operation. Oran would not survive the night, nor would as many as 13 other Israeli soldiers. At least 56 more had been wounded in the battle, marking the greatest loss the Israeli army had suffered in Gaza in such a short period of time. Quote, the casualties that the Qassam fighters caused since the eruption of this operation are more than what we caused in all PLL wars in southern Lebanon. End quote. An officer in the Palestinian Authority security apparatus told IHS Jane's 360, which is a military magazine. As dawn broke on July 21st, the streets outside of Gaza City's Al-Shifa hospital, which recently Israel had been attacking, the city's main medical clinic in the relatively upscale neighborhood of Ramal, filled with ambulances carrying wounded civilians from Shujaiya, which lay just a few kilometers away. Crowds of refugees were beginning to pour in from the embattled neighborhood as the Israeli shelling intensified. Interspersed among the crowd of frenzied medics, reporters, and stunned onlookers were masked Al-Qassam fighters who had been engaged moments before in heavy combat. A young woman from Gaza City rushed to join the crowds in Ramal. Her reaction typified the reception of the fighters received. Quote, I don't believe in God or religion, but when I caught the attention of one of the guys from the resistance, I wanted to give him support in a way he could understand. End quote. She recalled to me, quote, so I shouted to him, God bless you for what you did. And he looked over at me in his confident way and gave me the thumbs up sign. I was overcome. My heart just melted. End quote. The Al-Qassam brigades had not vanquished the vaunted Israeli military army, however. They delivered a bloody nose to its most elite units in the same way Hezbollah did during the Battle of Bint Jbeil in 2006, when the Lebanese guerrilla force delivered what Israeli troops described as, quote, an ambush from hell, end quote. In fact, Al-Qassam had applied lessons it learned through training with Hezbollah and its sponsors. As a senior commander of the group told Janes, quote, we have benefited from all the Iranian, Syrian, and Hezbollah tactical combat schools, and finally formulated an independent one that matches our situation and leaves us capable to respond to our enemy's challenge, end quote. Israeli Army Chief of Staff Benny Gantz and his senior staff assembled in Hakira Command Center in North Tel Aviv were startled at reports of Sergeant Shaul's capture. In fact, Shaul likely died immediately after he was pulled from the burning vehicle, but this was unknown to the military high command. Having bombarded Shujaiya from all sides for hours in a ham-handed effort to dislodge Al-Qassam and its tunnel network, with negligible success, the army turned its attention to the civil population. This next section is called Mowing the Lawn. And it may cover this, but it may not. Mowing the lawn is an Israeli policy that basically dictates that every few years they'll go in and essentially indiscriminately kill Palestinians in Gaza in a form of genocide. Mowing the lawn. The elite divisions of the Golani Brigade were quickly pinned down in the narrow lanes of Shujaiya and unable to withstand coordinated attacks by lightly armed fighters from the Al-Qassam brigades and assorted Gazan armed factions. So the Israeli military's high command made an audacious decision. It ordered all infantry to take shelter in the heavily protected Namir armored personnel carriers, then let loose an artillery barrage that engulfed the entire area in a storm of explosive rain. Quote, "We gave them a half an hour to get into vehicles, and we laid down fire, after which there were no more shouting from there, not even light weapons. No more shooting from there, not even light weapons," end quote. An Israeli army officer told Haaretz, "Were it not for the dangerous step which threatened to expose our Israeli troops to friendly fire, quote, we would be returning dozens of soldiers' bodies from the field," end quote. The officer remarked. In the end, the desperate maneuver wound up obliterating most of Shujaiya, killing over 120 of its residents and badly wounding hundreds more. A senior U.S. military officer with access to a July 21 Pentagon briefing on the Battle of Shujaiya told Mark Perry of Al Jazeera America that the Israeli military had deployed 11 battalions of heavy artillery against Shujaiya. This meant that at least 258 artillery pieces blasted the neighborhood with some 7,000 high explosive shells, including 4,800 during a 7-hour period. Details of the operation shocked U.S. officials, prompting Secretary of State John Kerry to sarcastically remark on a hot mic before a Fox News appearance, quote, "It's a hell of a pinpoint operation," end quote. It might not have occurred to Kerry that he could have prevented the destruction by negotiating on some of Hamas's humanitarian demands the week before. Quote, 11 battalions of IDF artillery equipment is equivalent to the artillery we deploy to support 2 divisions of U.S. infantry. The U.S. Department of Defense officer told Perry, quote, "That's a massive amount of firepower and it's absolutely deadly," end quote. A report broadcast on Israel's Channel 2 News profiled one of the artillery crews posted on the border of Gaza. A comment attached to the video dates the footage as taken on August 3rd, 2014. The report is an 8-minute broadcast portrait of an all-female unit with a few male trainers and soldiers assigned to help them carry 15-kilogram artillery shells they lob into Gaza neighborhoods with regularity. Quote, "Every 2 minutes we fire a shell into Gaza," end quote. Corporal Noam Kasman, a young female conscript, told Channel 2. Throughout the broadcast, the soldiers were seen signing each of the 120 and 155 millimeter artillery shells they launched with messages like, "To Adi, good luck with your new job," end quote. The shelling depicted in a news piece appeared to be so random that the soldiers must have had little idea where the munitions were falling, and the atmosphere was so casual that they had time to play backgammon and eat delivered sushi made in the shade. Quote, "This one's because I haven't showered in a week," end quote, one of the troops exclaimed as a smiling member of her unit launched another mortar. Quote, "How long have you been firing?" the Channel 2 reporter asked Corporal Noy Dayan. Quote, "Wow, I can't keep count, but I think we've been at it since morning," end quote. This next section is called Dahiya Doctrine. The Dahiya Doctrine. Israel's response to the humiliation it received at the hands of local fighters from the Al-Qassam brigades and other armed factions in Shujaiya was entirely characteristic of the military policies it has enacted over the last decade, and especially since its disengagement from Gaza. Rather than target its guerrilla forces, the Israeli military unleashed massive force against the civilian population in the theater of engagement. By the time the army was done, the entire neighborhoods in and around Shujaiya, like Al-Sha'af and Al-Tufa, had been reduced to apocalyptic moonscapes, with stately four-story homes transformed to blackened concrete shells. Nearly every building I came across when I visited Shujaiya weeks later was damaged to the point of being uninhabitable. Many had been reduced to rubble by 2,000-pound missiles fired by US-made F-16s. Others featured gaping holes from shells fired from the barrel of Israeli Merkava tanks, while many more were filled with spent mortars and 155mm artillery shells and littered with empty bullet casings left by the Israeli soldiers who occupied them during the 4 days of the ground invasion. In some of the houses the Israeli soldiers occupied, I found stars of David scrawled on furniture or etched into walls. The strategy Israel deployed in Shujaiya after the attempted capture of Sergeant Arun Shaul was developed during its attack on Lebanon in 2006. Against stiff resistance on the ground from well-trained fighters from Hezbollah, in the rocky terrain of southern Lebanon, the Israeli military resolved to obliterate Dahiya, the heavy Shiite southern Beirut suburb that served as Hezbollah's base of political support. Quote, "What happened in the Dahiya quarter of Beirut in 2006 will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on," end quote. Major General Gadi Eisenkot, then the commander of the Israeli Northern Command attacking Lebanon, told Israeli newspaper Yedoth Aharonoth at the time, "We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction there. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages. They are military bases. This is not a recommendation. This is a plan, and it has been approved." End quote. The Dahiya Doctrine reflected the thinking of a new generation of Israeli military strategists poised to confront the nation's enemies through a policy of collective punishment, preferably delivered by air, where Israeli pilots were impervious to death and injury. In 2008, 2 years after the doctrine was introduced, an Israeli military academic training center called the Institute for National Security Studies issued a remarkably similar blueprint entitled Disproportionate Force. The paper's author, Colonel Gabi Saboni, wrote, quote, "With an outbreak of hostilities, the Israeli army will need to act immediately, decisively, and with force that is disproportionate to the enemy's actions and the threat it poses. Such a response aims at inflicting damage and meting out punishment to an extent that will demand a long and expensive reconstruction process," end quote. The Dahiyya Doctrine guided Israel through its first two major assaults on the Gaza Strip, first in 2008 through 2009 with Operation Cast Lead, which was the operation that I tweeted out earlier, and will now, as a result, share on Facebook as well for those of you watching. Operation Cast Lead was particularly devastating. According to Norman Finkelstein, Operation Cast Lead, and this is not in the book, but according to Norman Finkelstein, Operation Cast Lead killed 1,400 Palestinian civilians, and 350 of them were children. So you can check out more information on that through the statuses I just shared. With Operation Cast Lead and then in 2012, during the military escalations known as Operation Pillar of Defense, when the Israeli military assassinated a few leaders of Gazan armed factions months before the latter operation, Jerusalem Post military correspondent Yaakov Katz wrote, quote, "The IDF is using this as an opportunity to do some maintenance work in Gaza and to mow the lawn, so to speak," end quote. Katz had let slip a phrase, quote, "mowing the lawn," that was becoming code among Israeli military strategists for the policy it would deploy towards Gaza. 2 years later, as Israel prepared for another assault on Gaza, Efraim Inbar, an Israeli political scientist and director of the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, outlined the political roots of the strategy. According to Inbar and a research associate, Eitan Shamir, a two-state solution with the Palestinians had become virtually unthinkable, leaving no other option but perpetual occupation and maintenance. In Gaza, he explained, Hamas had become intractable and had little intention of abandoning its armed resistance to the occupation. Unlike many other Israeli rightists who cast Hamas as an ISIS-like organization that ruled over Gaza against the consent of its population, Inbar recognized Hamas as a popular organization, quote, well-rooted in Palestinian society, end quote, that could not be destroyed through military force. At the same time, Inbar derided thinking emerging from Washington and Israeli liberals as, quote, solution-oriented, end quote, instead suggesting that there was no peaceful solution whatsoever to Israel's Palestinian problem. Gaza had become a warehouse for surplus humanity, a mostly young population of refugees caged in what British Prime Minister David Cameron called in July 2010, quote, an open-air prison or even concentration camp, end quote. When Gaza's inhabitants rattled their cage, as they would inevitably do, the Israeli military would have to teach them a harsh lesson, quote, against an implacable, well-entrenched, non-state enemy like Hamas. Inbar wrote, quote, Israel simply needs to mow the grass once in a while to degrade the enemy's capabilities. A war of attrition against Hamas is probably Israel's fate for the long term, end quote. In the summer of 2014, the Israeli military embarked on another exercise in mowing the lawn in Gaza. Its senior staff offered units in the field more latitude than ever before. When it published its findings on the 51-day war, the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem found, which just declared Israel as an apartheid state recently, B'Tselem found that the Israeli military had embraced an open fire policy, in which, quote, an open fire policy in which residential buildings were attacked from the air or ground, causing them to collapse on entire families, end quote. In other words, the Israeli Air Force was given authorization to target multifamily homes and precision airstrikes without proving their military value or their relation to any faction involved in the fighting. The policy resulted in a chilling statistic. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza, 19 families were removed from the civil record after the Israeli military exterminated most or all members. Quote, B'Tselem has no knowledge of who is responsible for formulating this policy under which such strikes on homes were permitted, nor who ordered it, end quote, the organization noted. With unprecedented freedom to attack civilian targets, the Israeli army enacted the most robust fulfillment of the Dahaya doctrine in its history, obliterating Shujaiya in the course of about 48 hours on July 19th and July 20th. The U.S. Defense Department official who had received internal Pentagon briefings on Israel's assault on Shujaiya reacted with shock to Israel's use of U.S.-made 155 millimeter howitzers with a kill radius of 164 feet. Quote, the only possible reason for doing that is to kill a lot of people in a short period of time, and as short a period of time as possible, end quote. The senior U.S. military officer told Perry of Al Jazeera America, quote, it's not mowing the lawn, it's removing the topsoil, end quote. Surviving Shujaiya is the name of this next section. When I arrived in the Gaza Strip on August 14th, the war was into its 38th day. By this point, Al-Qassam fighters were still huddled in tunnels and completely out of view. The Israeli military had pulled back and was preparing to prosecute the rest of the war by air from F-16s and drones. Hundreds of thousands of residents of Gaza from obliterated border areas like Shujaiya had been left homeless and were forced to languish in United Nations Relief Works Agency, UNRWA schools, where they were still vulnerable to targeted Israeli airstrikes. With the announcement of a 5-day humanitarian ceasefire on the 14th, however, Shujaiya residents were able to return to the ruins of their homes and pitch tents outside. On the first day of their brief ceasefire, neighbors greeted one another with joyous hugs, celebrating their survival and asking after those who had gone missing. This is Khalil Atash, a resident of Shujaiya back in 2014, and the remnants of his son's bedroom. And this photo was taken by Dan Cohen. I entered Gaza with my colleague Dan Cohen, who was living in the occupied West Bank at the time. When we entered Gaza in mid-August, we were among only a handful of Western reporters working in the Gaza Strip. The pack of correspondents who had flooded Gaza City to cover the Israeli ground invasion had mostly left, with many heading immediately off to Kurdistan to follow the U.S. campaign against ISIS. Though we received credentials from Israel's government press office, GPO, without any trouble, the GPO was freely issuing press cards to foreign reporters, enabling their entry into Gaza after having banned them during Operation Cast Lead in 2008 through 2009. Israeli authorities had just denied Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to entry to Gaza, with residents flooding back into Shujaiya for the first time. Dan and I were able to gather first-hand accounts of what happened on the fateful night when Israeli forces invaded. During the August ceasefire, we were accompanied through Gaza by Abba Razek, a 24-year-old translator and researcher from Gaza City's middle-class Al-Nazar neighborhood, whom I had corresponded with via social media well before I arrived in Gaza. Abba, and I had many friends in common, though she had only met most of them through Skype and social media, as she was unable to visit the West Bank and could rarely obtain a visa to travel to the Western world at all. Like many of her friends, she was secular, went around Gaza without a hijab, was unaffiliated with any political faction, and prone to savage criticism of both Hamas and the Fatah-run Palestinian Authority, but especially the Palestinian Authority, which she viewed as a corrupt occupation subcontractor. When Abba appeared on an Israeli news program with a hostile anchor who demanded to know if she would condemn Hamas during the 2012 military escalation, Abba shot back that despite whatever internal criticism she might have, quote, in times of war, Gaza is Hamas and Hamas is Gaza. Some of the educated English-speaking youth in Gaza refer to her comeback as the Abba moment, the point when a young Palestinian woman told Israel that she understood what Israel wanted and that she would never give it to them. Abba's name was inspired by a distinctively Palestinian term that meant stubbornness in the face of power, and she seemed determined to live up to it. Almost as soon as Dan, Ebba, and I arrived in Shujaiya, a group of men reclining on mats beside a makeshift stove summoned us inside what was left of their home, a four-level multi-family structure that was barely distinguishable from the other mangled wrecks lining the dusty roads of the neighborhood. Khalil Atash, a tall 63-year-old grandfather, implored us to sit down with his family and hear about the attack that destroyed everything he had. As we entered an exposed area that used to serve as the family salon, Atash motioned to his son heating a teapot above a few logs. Quote, "They've set us back 100 years. Look at us. We're now burning wood to survive," he muttered. After handing us coffee in small plastic cups, Atash led us up to a still intact staircase and into the home to see what was left of it. On the second floor, tank shells had blown off the walls of what was supposed to have provided boudoirs for two of his newly married children. All that was left of the bathroom were the hot and cold knobs on the shower. On the next floor up, four small children scampered barefoot across shattered glass and jagged shards of concrete. A bunk bed, a bunk bed and a crib were badly singed in the attack. Gigantic holes opened walls to a panoramic view of the destroyed neighborhood. Everything Atash had worked for was gone, but the damage could have been far worse. According to Atash, the attack on the Shujaiya began. The Israeli army attempted to evacuate the family. They had received a phone call in which they were ordered to leave in Arabic, but the family was sure the call was a prank. When they answered the phone again, a soldier exclaimed, "You think this is a joke? You have 5 minutes." End quote. 3 minutes later, an F-16 sent a missile through the roof. In an incredible stroke of luck, the missile did not explode. It remained lodged in the ceiling until a day prior to my visit, when a bomb detonation crew dismantled it. I asked why the family had remained in the ruins of their home when the army could attack again at any time. Quote, "We have nowhere else to go now," Khalil Atash explained. "You only die once, and we're not afraid after what we've been through. So we just decided to live in our house." As with Shujaiya, during the ground invasion, the Israeli military comprehensively flattened other border areas from the Bet Hanun in the northern Kazaa to Rafah in the south. In Bet Hanun in the north to Kuhazaa to Rafah in the south, by flooding border areas with explosives until nearly all of their residents were forced to head west for shelter. Israel was tightening the cage on the entire population. No matter where the refugees fled, there was no safe space. In an empty chamber upstairs where the mothers and the children of the Atash family slept, the only inhabitable room in the house, the family gathered to recount their story of survival. Khalil Atash's son, 30-year-old Tamir, described to me how the night unfolded. Quote, "The missiles started getting closer and began to hit everywhere so randomly," he said, detailing how the strikes on Shujaiya gradually intensified after the first hour. "So I just lost it. I was watching my neighbors die, and I was so close to them. I felt like I was dead too. I had two choices. Either I die doing nothing at the house, or do something about it. so I chose to do something. End quote. Tamir called an ambulance crew and begged the driver to help rescue his trapped family. Quote, "All I can do is pray for you," the driver told him, refusing to come to their aid. But other first responders rushed headlong into the maelstrom, risking their lives to save as many of the fleeing residents as they could. By this time, the neighborhood was engulfed in flames and shrouded in darkness. Israeli forces had bombed all of its electrical towers. He and his family decided to make a run for it in the street. Neighbors followed closely behind them, embarking on a desperate sprint for survival as homes went up in flames around them. This is a photo of the Atash family and the remains of their bedroom. I'm sorry, my camera's not coming into focus. Relying on cell phone flashlights to illuminate their path, the fleeing residents rushed ahead under withering shelling. Tens of people fell every few hundred meters, Tamir told me, but they continued anyway, sprinting for a full kilometer until they reached safety close to Gaza City. As soon as he reached what seemed to be a sanctuary from the fury of explosions and collapsing buildings, Tamer said he was overcome with guilt. Friends and neighbors were struck in the neighborhood with no one to evacuate them. He decided to return to help anyone he could. "I am from Shujaiya. I have no place to go. We don't own the land," he explained. "This is our only home, so of course I come back." It was well past midnight. Shujaiya was in flames, and fighters from the Al-Qassam brigades were beginning to mobilize for a counterattack. Quote, "The situation outside was literally hell," Tamir recalled. Tamir Atash noticed the violent frenzy intensify around the time that news of the alleged capture of Sergeant Arun Shaul by Qassam fighters reached Israeli army commanders. He had no idea that a soldier might have been taken, but he sensed that something dramatic had just taken place. Quote, "The F-16s were no longer up in the sky bombing us. They were flying just above the houses," Tamer recalled. "It felt like an atomic bomb with 4 F-16s coming one way and another from the opposite direction, weaving between the houses. At this point, we decided we were not going to make it. We said our last prayers, and that was it, because we know that when the Israelis lose one of their soldiers, they become lunatics. We just knew that they had suffered something. We could sense it." Tamar watched some of his neighbors jump from fourth-floor windows as their homes burst into flames. Others rushed out in their night clothes, prompting him and other men to hand over their shirts and even their trousers to women scurrying half-exposed through the darkened streets. After giving the shirt off his back to one woman, he gave his sandals to another who had sliced her feet open on the rubble. Quote, "Sure, I was crazy and stupid, but I just wanted for them to survive," he said. Quote, "If I had to die, then fine, but someone had to make a sacrifice." By dawn, waves of survivors poured from Shujaiya into Gaza City. Sons had carried their fathers on their backs. Mothers had hoisted children into trucks and ambulances. Others searched frantically for missing family members when they arrived, only to learn that they had fallen under shelling. For many, it seemed to be a continuation of the Nakba, the fateful days of 1948 when Zionist militias forcibly expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their land. This time, however, there was almost nowhere for the refugees to flee. Back in Shujaiya, the shelling momentarily subsided for a 2-hour truce. But the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, proved generally unable to evacuate those trapped inside the area, possibly because of the Israeli army's refusal to coordinate with its first responders. Thus, the stragglers and wounded were at the mercy of Israel's Golani Brigade, where soldiers had taken up positions at the edge of Shujaiya, occupying homes just east of the area's main mosque. Anyone bold enough to return to the besieged neighborhood to search for the lost family members had entered a death trap. That's chapter 4. So we've been reading for about 2 hours and 15 minutes. We read the intro as well as 4 chapters. Once again, if you're listening, this is The 51-Day War, written by Max Blumenthal, who traveled into Gaza with Dan Cohen back in 2014 during the 5-day ceasefire. I hope you learned something. I will be continuing reading these chapters in the coming days and possibly weeks. Enjoy the rest of your night. Power to the people.